For the first time in her life, Gypsy wasn't too sick. She was not sick enough. Her old tricks, the trembling, the stumbles, I can't see, I can't hear. The selective helplessness wouldn't save her anymore. They would expose her. And she felt trapped, cornered by the lies that once kept her afloat. Her good girl act, the one that had always been her weapon and her shield, was now prison walls. And she couldn't tear them down, couldn't face the truth of who she'd become. So instead, she decided to preserve that illusion at any cost. She needed control back. And in Gypsy's mind, that meant keeping the wall intact, the persona unharmed. So Gypsy didn't confront the truth, she plotted against it. She told herself she was protecting her freedom, Nick, and her future, but really, she was just protecting her mask. The plan was deliberate, dark, intoxicating. A plan that would let her keep her good girl image alive, even as she prepared to do something unspeakably dark. Then came that moment. The moment that cemented in Gypsy's mind she had no other choice. The forms. Those endless forms. Medical releases, travel waivers, charity requests, funding applications, community sponsorships. For years they'd been signed without question. Everyone believed Gypsy. Their story had been gospel in that community. Their struggle was practically folklore. People had cried for Gypsy, prayed for Gypsy. They had donated, volunteered, built ramps, made meals, gave rides, and hosted events for her. Gypsy had been their miracle child, but then the questions started. Discrepancies appeared. The numbers didn't add up. The travel grants seemed to be misused, and doctors started to contradict each other. The records didn't match the symptoms Gypsy was describing. And the rumors, well, those things spread like wildfire in small communities. People started to wonder why her diagnosis changed so often and her story kept shifting, why all the donations were needed but nothing seemed to be improving. And suddenly the curtain, the one Gypsy had spent her entire childhood tugging closed, was being pulled open. The performance was ending, and with that came terrifying new words: fraud, investigation, charges, and accountability. Not good, not innocent, not sweet girl. Real consequences. Adult consequences. And the Gypsy, it felt like everyone was waking up at once. The community no longer applauded and prayed and cried for her. They were watching instead, scrutinizing, trying to figure out what had been real and what had been faked. She expected the doctors to remain reliable pieces on the board. They always have been. They had listened, they had documented, and they had reacted exactly as they were meant to, according to the script. But then the medicine changed. The staff started to rotate. The hospitals compared notes. One doctor started to ask for older files, and another mentioned discrepancies. They took longer than usual to start flipping through their charts, and Gypsy felt the shift. They started asking more questions. They started pausing more frequently. The performance was slipping. These were people who had once accepted everything. The wheelchair, the illnesses, the symptoms, the practice tones. Now they were talking to each other, to her mother, and not her. Gypsy watched it happen. She watched a doctor tell Dee Dee that she didn't need to stay in the room. She watched another ask her to walk a few steps without assistance, as if he already knew. She watched a nurse mention that her vitals were stronger than expected. And she saw the exact moment the nurse decided not to pursue the thought further, the way someone chooses not to embarrass a child. These were fractures in her script, and she didn't have a quick fix for fractures. So she redirected her mother the only way she could. Mom, maybe they didn't get the records from Louisiana. Maybe that's why they're so confused. A small crack, a thin wedge, a way to control Dee Dee's attention long enough to keep the larger break from happening. But even that didn't land the way it used to. Add in, there was that one word, malingering. Her doctor scrawled that across one particular note, and it ruptured everything. Her mother nodded, but it wasn't trusting the way Gypsy needed it to be. It was calculating. A nod that tracked the inconsistencies she could no longer ignore. The missing pills, the accidental slips out of the wheelchair, the way doctors now spoke directly to Gypsy as if she didn't need Dee Dee around anymore. The world that once revolved around her symptoms and her sweetness and her frailty was turning away. The professionals she'd relied on, unknowingly scaffolded her entire identity, were no longer cooperating with the script. They were seeing her, not the role she played, and being seen in that way was the greatest threat. And she understood that perfectly. Once doctors start comparing notes, the performance was no longer hers to direct. And once a performance is no longer hers, there was only one solution left. And inside Gypsy, something detonated. It was rage. Rage at her mother for leaving her father years ago. Rage that her mother didn't manage to stay sweet enough, perfect enough, good enough to keep the family intact. Rage that her mother had built Gypsy's entire identity around goodness, leaving Gypsy with no identity of her own except the one she manufactured through illness and manipulation. In Gypsy's mind, her mother had trapped her, molded her into something she could only survive through performance. Her mother had drilled good girl so deeply into her that Gypsy learned to weaponize it. If she admitted the truth, not the truth that she had fed Nick and the community, but the actual truth she'd have to face, what she had become. A liar, manipulator, and a thief. Someone who exaggerated illnesses for gifts, sympathy, money, and control. Her entire life had been built on deception, and she harmed the very person who cared for her the most, someone standing on their precipice of becoming a murderer. And Gypsy couldn't face that mirror. She couldn't imagine living in a world where she was no longer the good girl. So she looked for an escape hatch. She told herself her mother had caged her. Her mother had forced her into this corner. And if her mother had never demanded this perfection in the first place, had kept the family intact, had never insisted on her being such a good girl, and had never built their life around her illnesses, none of this would be happening. She'd been pushed, and she was desperate, and she was justified. Then there was her father. He once played the role she needed him to. He was concerned and shaken. He was tearful over the phone when Dee Dee updated him on another hospital visit. He reacted the way she expected him to react, and for a while, that was enough. But over time, the pattern changed. There were less calls. His voice steadied. He stopped asking questions. All updates seemed more routine. He started talking more about Christy and Mia. About work, he let entire months go without checking on her. That shift mattered. He was more distracted and he was halfway listening. She adjusted. When people drift, they are pulled back with stronger lines. That was the logic running underneath her thoughts. She lost control, so she tried things, a message with a hint of danger, worsening symptoms, a test to see if his performance would return to the level she remembered, and it didn't. He responded politely and briefly, or not at all. He offered reassurance but not attention. His priorities had shifted, and his life moved away from her orbit. And Gypsy felt that shift like she always did. An unreliable role is a weak role. A weak role can be removed or replaced. Her father was no longer someone to impress. He was no longer afraid, no longer someone who mattered to the structure of the story she was building. But the memory of how he used to respond stayed with her, as a benchmark, a reference point for how people should react when given the right script. And when that kind of reaction died out from the person who should have given it automatically, It only made the reaction she could still get from doctors, neighbors, and Nick that much more important. In her mind, the pattern held. If one door stops opening, you find another. And if a door can't be opened again, you stop trying, you remove it, and you move on. So the fear became fuel, the guilt became anger, and the panic became planning. And the idea that once terrified her now became the only option. Online, Nick had become everything she had molded him into by careful, calculated scripting, and Gypsy knew how to say the right words in the right order and how to nudge him gently toward the edges of himself until he believed he'd always been standing there. Nick began to think he had a darkness in him long before she arrived, something he never explored, a villain buried beneath the awkward shyness and sweet intentions, and Gypsy encouraged this belief. Yes, that's who you really are. I didn't create it, I just helped you express it. That was the plan. Because Nick wasn't a hardened criminal, he wasn't a predator, he wasn't some lurking monster just waiting for permission to strike. He was malleable, trusting, desperate for love. And there she was. He was innocent enough to be shaped like clay. And according to Gypsy, her mother had been oppressive, overbearing, someone who hurt her, who controlled her. Trapped her in a wheelchair she didn't need and stole her freedom. Punished her for wanting a life like anyone else, and Nick didn't know any different. He believed her because he loved her. In the script she wrote for him, there were only 3 characters: Gypsy, the innocent princess, her mother, the wicked villain, and Nick, the hero who just happened to have a dark side strong enough to slay the villain. She told him he was perfect for the job, that God had made them for each other. She told him destiny was calling for him to slip into the role that nobody else could fill. But that if he couldn't handle it, well, she just had to find someone else. Beneath the sweetness and the fantasy, the truth was far colder. She needed someone to take the fall. She needed someone to absorb the blame for everything she feared would come crashing down around her. Investigations, inconsistencies, lies she could no longer juggle, and the word fraud crawling toward her name. He was just another brick, another buffer between Gypsy and the truth, and when she crafted the plan, she gave him 2 roles at once. You're my hero and you are my villain. A duality he'd never been offered before. He was just villain enough to get the job done and just heroic enough to believe he was saving the woman he loved. Gypsy made sure he believed every word of it. He was chosen and righteous and powerful. And she needed his hands and his brutality. She needed someone who would walk directly into the fire and believe without question it was all for love. Nick thought he was stepping into a fairy tale, and Gypsy knew she was building a weapon. And the plan was almost ready. And here's the thing no one ever talks about. Those tiny, imperceptible moments where the mask slipped. Dee Dee, the doctors, the neighbors, the volunteers, the pastors, the charity workers, all the people who saw Gypsy and thought, poor baby, they missed them. They missed the smirk. That split-second curl of her lips when she claimed she was losing her hearing. The kind of expression a child makes when a lie sounds so good, when it feels powerful. Dee Dee called it nerves, doctor called it an involuntary reaction, but it wasn't. It was a flood of dopamine rushing into her brain as she felt control. They missed the turning away at crucial moments, the way Gypsy would break eye contact the second someone got too close to the truth, as if looking directly at them might crack the illusion. They missed the tugging of the hair, the quiet fidgeting, not out of anxiety, not anticipatory, The kind people knew when they were waiting for a reward. The kind that comes right before someone sweetly asks for something they know you'll already give. They missed the blinking, the rapid, fluttering, dramatic blinking, right until she got what she wanted, and then the eyes would shift, still, cold. A frozen stare people get when they're calculating, not suffering. And everyone saw sick girl, no one saw the girl studying them right back. But charm only works when the audience never looks away. So she gave Nick what he needed, fantasy, darkness, and a script. She fed the shadow inside him the same way that she fed her own, with that sing-song voice that made everything sound harmless even when it wasn't. What if there's a way you could protect me? What if you were strong enough to do what I can't? What if you saved me? And those words stroked his ego. They fed the character she had built for him. The dark hero, the misunderstood villain, the man who could do something no one else had the courage to do. She didn't have to say the whole thing. She was skilled in half sentences and silences, suggestions that weren't suggestions. And Nick leaned in. Online, the two of them built a world no one else could see, a world where he was powerful and she was trapped. He was the only one who understood and she was the damsel. He was the blade. And each night, Gypsy's fingers moved faster, her messages grew darker, and her fantasies grew sharper, and her need was stronger. Not a need to escape her mother, but to escape unraveling the guilt she had hidden from. To bury the fear of being exposed. To bury the part of her that knew she'd never be able to keep up this act forever. In the months before the crime, Gypsy's frustration simmered into something electric. Dee Dee started to catch her in more moments of forgetting to look blind, to look weak. A moment where she was able to open a door too quickly and she stood too steadily and she would be able to grab something off a shelf too easily. And each time her mother's brow would tighten just a little, Gypsy felt those shifts. Because the worst thing that could happen wasn't losing her wheelchair or her sympathy or her story. It was losing control. Her ability to steer the narrative. Her place at the center of her mother's world. The one thing she'd always been able to count on. Performance. Online, Nick was lonely and eager, and in love with the character she'd made for him. He believed every word, that he was the Dark Protector and the Avenger, the only one chosen to fix what nobody else could even see. The night of the crime began long before the knife ever touched her mother, in a girl who needed control more than she needed truth. And finally, Nick was already on his way, and Gypsy did what she always did best. She played a role. Soft voice, wide eyes, helpless posture. The innocent girl waiting for her hero in a story she'd written herself. Finally, Nick entered the house the way she had instructed him to, just following direction he'd been given. Gypsy positioned herself in the bathroom. It allowed the plan to remain compartmentalized, and he was assigned to the task. She was assigned to the next step. She listened for completion, an indication the first phase was over. When it was quiet again, she left the bathroom and she walked into her mother's room to assess, to clean up. She moved accordingly. There were practical considerations: what had been touched, shifted, concealed, and what needed to be staged. She retrieved a Barney plush and placed it behind her mother's head. It was structural. The scene needed to look a certain way, and she adjusted it to match. Nick stood nearby. His usefulness had been tied to the task he'd already completed. She guided him toward the bed, to test whether he would continue to follow her direction now that the act was done. His refusal provided information. He had completed his function, but could not extend beyond it. That changed his position in her internal hierarchy. When someone fulfills a role but cannot adapt, the role ends. So she continued without him, shook baby powder where she believed there were footprints or residue. Evenly, she lowered the thermostat. She placed objects back into positions that wouldn't raise suspicions. She removed all traces of herself from the home. All of it done with the same energy someone uses while straightening a room before leaving for a trip. Logistical. Her mind moved ahead. What needed to be erased? What needed to be left? What narrative would make the most sense once the house was discovered? Nick, now finished with his involvement, sat quietly. She had no need to involve him further and no interest in reinforcing the script she had written for him. He served his purpose. And because he had seen the interior of the plan more than she intended, she began adjusting her strategy in real time. When someone becomes a liability, the story adjusts around them accordingly. Her next action wasn't sentimental either. She opened Facebook. Not because she was impulsive, not because she was overwhelmed. Because this would shift the timeline outward, away from her. It activated the next phase. Discovery concerned attention and ultimately, the diversion of focus onto him. She typed a vulgar message without hesitation. It was simply the next step. Her mother was no longer an obstacle. Nick was no longer essential. The plan moved forward, just the closing of one door and the removal of another.